President Biden fielded questions Thursday on everything from immigration to how far he will go to break the filibuster. Here's some of what we heard in the East Room of the White House.
I've been hired to solve problems, not create division. We should go back to a position of the filibuster that existed just when I came to the United States Senate 120 years ago. It used to be you had to stand there and talk and talk and talk and talk until you collapsed.
Biden also announced a new goal to distribute 200 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine during his first 100 days in office, double his original target. Largely absent from the discussion was a topic that has dominated the national conversation this week: a mass shooting at a supermarket in Colorado. Joining me to open their notebooks are four of Washington's very best. Errin Haines, editor-at-large for the 19th. Zolan Kanno-Youngs, my colleague from the New York Times and a White House correspondent. Sahil Kapur, national political reporter for NBC News. And Ashley Parker, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. Ashley, you covered President Trump for 4 years. What's the difference between a Trump press conference and a Biden press conference?
There's so many differences, Peter, but I'll just focus on one or two. One is that Trump's press conferences are theater and spectacle, and they could often be very combative with the reporters, with the president sort of using the reporters as foils, and sometimes even the reporters kind of posturing in that role of questioner. And that's not to say that President Biden is incapable of getting frustrated with the media. We saw some flashes of that as well. But it was sort of a calmer, more deliberate news conference. And one other thing which also changed the dynamic is coronavirus, because this is an administration, the Biden administration, that takes precautions and mitigation measures very seriously. You saw social distancing in that room. You saw less reporters than you would traditionally have, which in a certain way gave the reporters in the room a chance to ask a question and a follow-up, and sometimes a follow-up on the follow-up and a third question. So you could have sort of more substantive and lengthy exchanges in certain ways with President Biden, we saw.
Zolan, you were in the East Room yesterday. What do you think we learned about Biden's approach to governing, his doctrine for governing? He talked about the art of the possible.
He talked about the art of the possible. He even described himself. He said, look, I am pragmatic. I'm paraphrasing there, but that was really the takeaway from this. At one point, when he was asked one of the, I believe, only questions about the recent mass shootings that have occurred, there was a remark that I really thought was key, a key takeaway of the press conference, and that's where he focused on timing. He really specified that when it comes to a successful presidency, it is about timing and prioritizing certain issues, and really that's the way Biden campaigned, and that's what you're seeing him deal with when it comes to each of these issues and crises that are occurring thus far early in his administration. You really did see that even though he's going to face criticism on some areas, he's still going to have a similar approach that we've seen for the decades that he's been governing.
Well, yesterday, that press conference, of course, Biden was repeatedly questioned about voting rights.
The Republican voters I know find this despicable. Republican voters, the folks outside this White House. I'm not talking about the elected officials. I'm talking about voters. And so I'm convinced that we'll be able to stop this, because it is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle.
Just hours later, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, a Republican, signed a sweeping election bill into law, making absentee voting more difficult and even making it illegal to give food and water to voters waiting in line. Georgia Democratic State Representative Park Cannon, who opposed the law, was arrested after she knocked on Governor Kemp's door to ask permission to watch him sign the bill. Biden today, which read, quote, "This is Jim Crow in the 21st century. It must end." Errin, Republicans say this is about election security. President Biden says it's about Jim Crow. You're from Atlanta. You covered the Georgia legislature. Help put this into context for us. What's happening down there, and by extension, really, in many states across the country?
Well, Peter, I know that, for a lot of Americans, this does have to do with the big lie. And yes, this latest iteration of voter restricting voter access in the Georgia legislature is in response to the 2020 election, where you saw an expanded electorate that included a record, turnout of Black voters. But in fact, I covered the Georgia legislature 15 years ago when the state was pioneering voter ID laws that were mirrored by other states after Georgia was able to successfully pass that legislation. And so you're seeing it happening again here. It'll be interesting to see what other states pick up, where Georgia has left off here now with the signing into law, things that will now make illegal, passing out food and water to voters standing in hours-long lines, which in itself is a form of voter suppression. In that press conference yesterday, you saw President Biden. I mean, that was, one of the moments where he was particularly passionate, was really expressing his outrage at what he was seeing happening in states like Georgia, calling it un-American, calling it sick. The legislation that was being proposed and then was later signed into law, the same day that he made those remarks. I think that as much as he was speaking to reporters in that moment, he was also speaking to the Black voters who helped him and President Harris get into office, and to signal to them that he understands that in many ways, addressing the issue of voting rights was something that they in fact voted for in electing the two of them. And so HB1 and SB1, HR1 and SB1 have certainly taken on an added sense of urgency as SB 202 in Georgia is now headed to the courts.
Right. That's the legislation the Democrats are proposing in Congress that would set national rules for elections across the country. Republicans are very opposed to that. Sahil, conservatives point to some recent polling showing that many voters do support ID requirements, but this latest round of laws goes well beyond that. What's the Republican argument here? What is the argument for election security by barring people from handing out water in lines? How does that improve election security?
Peter, this is going to be a whale of a fight. Democrats are gearing up. Excuse me. Democrats are gearing up for a very, very fierce battle over S1, which is the For the People Act. It has passed the House. Democrats have some work to do to cobble together the 50 votes they need to get a Senate majority, let alone 60. They argue this is an inflection point as to whether American democracy remains a democracy. Some say this country could go on the road to plutocracy if that bill isn't passed to protect voting rights. Now, to your question, Republicans say that these measures are about ballot integrity. They believe that they are necessary. They believe they're valid. Voter ID requirements are necessary to protect ballot integrity. In states like Georgia, the contradiction here is that the Republican-led officials there have certified that there was no widespread fraud. So it's not hard to look at this and see it kind of as a solution in search of a problem, these voter ID requirements. Of course, Democrats say that this is simply about shutting them out, trying to prevent their voters from voting. And the Republican argument against S1, at least one of them, is that there are some unrelated measures to voting rights that figures like Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, have highlighted to attack it.
Zolan, Senator Joe Manchin, the moderate Democrat from West Virginia, who seems to be in the middle of everything these days, has said he has some qualms about the Democratic election legislation and he would like to see some bipartisan compromise. But do we think that's even possible in this day and age, or is it really just so inextricably partisan, so much about power, that there's no way these two sides could ever come together on a single bill that resets election laws so that everybody agrees we have a fair vantage point for everybody to compete?
It certainly seems unlikely that there could be some bipartisanship in this area thus far. I would say from what we've seen, I mean, many Republicans on the Hill have made clear that that they believe that this is an issue that the states should decide. At least that's what they're saying at this time. And when you have Joe Manchin, he has made clear that he is a hard no when it comes to eliminating the filibuster. So right now, it kind of puts the White House in a corner in a way where when it comes to legislation such as voting rights, or, we were talking before about the mass shootings that have happened, any gun measures, potentially immigration legislation. Can you really get that legislation passed in Congress right now with Joe Manchin's position? Or is that going to put the White House in a position where they're really limited to executive action that would likely face lawsuits? It seems like that's likely.
Well, Errin, in fact, the voting restrictions were not the only Jim Crow comparison we heard. The Democrats and Joe Biden are talking about the filibuster as another relic from a bygone era. Talk a little bit about that. Why is that an issue about race? Democrats have, of course, used the filibuster when they have been in the minority. Republicans have used the filibuster when they have been in the minority. How does this get us back into the issue of race at this point?
Well, because the filibuster,
Well,
while that may not, while that may not have been the original intent, we know that it has been used, over the years to inhibit, racial progress in particular. And so, while that wasn't the initial intent, that most certainly has been the impact and the intent. In the late part of the last century. But what was interesting, Senator Raphael Warnock out of Georgia, who came into office in that Senate runoff in Georgia that gave the Democrats a majority in the Senate, a governing majority in Congress, was asked today about where he stood on filibuster reform, and he really attempted to reframe that conversation, saying really this is this shouldn't be a question about whether Democrats are on board with filibuster reform, but whether Republicans are on board with voting rights and expanding the electorate, that they should really be asked where they stand on voting rights and democracy, as opposed to where Democrats stand on filibuster reform. And so I thought that was really interesting, as a way to frame this, knowing that many Americans are in favor of more people voting, not less.
Sahil, the president talked about a talking filibuster, sort of the Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith goes to Washington version of Washington. But would that actually change things? Would it actually help President Biden get his agenda through if the voting threshold is still 60 in order to cut off debate?
It's an excellent question, Peter, and this is why the details matter so much. There are ways you can structure a talking filibuster that would really empower the majority and put the minority in a difficult place. For instance, if you change the standard to, instead of 3/5 of the entire Senate to proceed to debate, 3/5 of those voting in present. If you force 41 senators to be on the chamber or near the chamber, ready for a vote at any point, that creates a situation where a very determined majority can outlast the minority by keeping enough members in the chamber. Maybe if some of them decide to go home at 3 or 4 a.m., they can call the vote and push something through. So the details really matter here. There are some senators I've spoken to who wonder if a talking filibuster is realistic. The truth is the Senate has a lot of elderly members in their 70s and 80s who get accommodations for the evening. How many, and they're in both parties, are they going to want to stick around and tough it out through nights and potentially weekends over things like this? So there are many questions that are being considered here. And a talking filibuster is the one idea that seems to have support from Senator Manchin, who kind of holds the keys to what Democrats do next. He is not in favor of abolishing it, but he has said it should be more painful for the minority to obstruct bills. And if anything does happen here, Democrats are going to use that as the gateway to a solution.